Got it. So I'm Constance Kehoe. I have the pleasure of serving as president of Revolutionary Westchester 250, coming up very soon now, 2 years, 2026. And I will be introducing you to Dr. Michael Crowder, although his name is showing up as Nora. But believe me, Professor Michael Crowder has been our moderator for our, believe it or not, our 5th book discussion, and about a year. And it's always been so interesting to hear all of you chime in on your responses to these titles. And I always say, really have to read the book. But if you want to talk, we've got the professor who may cut you off. But so I just wanted to, well, I will be certainly thanking Michael for doing this, but I did want to mention a couple of upcoming things. Of course, you can find out all that we're doing on our website, our Facebook. We now have more on Instagram, but you'll have to look these up yourself, on our site. But I'm just going to mention a few that you might entice you. Next weekend on Saturday, our very favorite local Michael Grillo, who you usually see doing George Washington. He's probably done thousands of kids talks in his 30-some years of reenacting and being George Washington. But he is involved with other personalities too. And in this case, down in Tuckahoe, the folks who are working on the Ward House preservation will be there at the Tuckahoe Library while he does a presentation. We're calling it the Recruiting Sergeant. And then we have 3 different programs for Black History Month, because we really want to draw attention to the Black soldiers who were involved in the Revolution. And two of these involve a professor from Toledo, Dr. Shirley Green, and she's written a book called Revolutionary Black. She actually found some of her own relatives who were in the Rhode Island Regiment. So you'll see the library talks, free and public, that we're doing in February with her. And we're also involved with the Bethany Arts community in Ossining. And there's a Black History exhibit, and a group of reenactors from New Jersey are coming up on opening night of that. That's February 2nd. And of course, March is Women History Month, and we're bringing back our very favorite Judith Calaora, who tells that incredible real history story of Deborah Sampson, who served in a Massachusetts regiment, disguised as a man, served in Westchester, and was injured here. She was found out to not be a man, and she fought and got a pension and honorable discharge. So that's at a library. It's at the Greenberg Library in March. So I won't go any further. There are things in September about Andre and Arnold, and things in July about the making the Declaration of Independence unanimous when it was approved in White Plains, July 9th. So we keep up with stuff. There's always something going on. We love to hear from you. And if you have book suggestions, we're certainly happy if you want to email me. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to play his teacher role here with us and get our conversation going. Michael, thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. It's good to see everybody. I hope you're all staying warm. I'm not, but here in freezing New Rochelle. Thanks for having me back again, Connie. I really, really enjoy doing this. It's one of my favorite sort of activities that we get a chance to do on a regular basis. And I think, Connie, you said this is our 5th?
Yeah.
That's a lot, yeah. So thanks all for being here. And as Connie mentioned, I'm not Nora Slenimsky. That's my colleague at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University, which is where I work. My name is Michael, but if you call me Nora, I won't be upset because she's wonderful. Um, so just a couple of things that just to kind of start off with in terms of questions and comments. So if you'd like to ask a question, there's two ways to do that, or make a comment. The best way, I'll be honest, just for me, so I can keep track of everybody, is if you use the raise hand function that should be at the bottom bar of your screen. And if you have a question, it'll give the little raise hand icon, and that way I can keep track. And then if you'd like, you can unmute and speak. Or if you don't feel like speaking or are not on camera, you are welcome to just type questions into the chat, which is there at the bottom of the screen as well. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and then I'll keep track, and then I can allow you to ask your question. If not, just type your questions or comments in the chat, and that way I can keep track of them there as well. So those are our two options. And so this is really exciting. This is the second time I read the book. I read the book when it came out, I think 2019, shortly thereafter. In fact, I remember because it was at the height of the pandemic. And it was really fun to revisit it. And at Connie's suggestion, actually, what I want to do now, just to sort of begin the conversation, is to play a short video that as I mentioned, Connie let me know about, which is Rick Atkinson himself sort of describing the early stages of conceiving of this project. So I think that's a really cool thing to do to start off with. And then I'll have just a couple of comments. I really don't want to, I certainly don't want to monopolize the conversation. So I'll offer just a couple of comments just to get us thinking. And then we really want it to be discussion. So please do either raise your yellow hand or type your question in the chat, and we'll get to it for sure over the next 50 minutes. So what I'm going to do then now is just play this video. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully do it correctly. Sorry, 1 second. I have it up. And that will get us sort of going again on thinking about this book. So bear with me for 1 second. Share my screen. Okay. And I realize I just made a mistake. I have to enable the sound. There we go. So we can hear Rick Atkinson talk. Okay. Can all of you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. We'll just go ahead and start. And actually, can I ask, is the sound working?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right.
Who needs another book on the American Revolution? Historians have been writing about the rebellion virtually since it ended nearly 2.5 centuries ago. Personally, I've previously focused on more recent wars in 6 earlier books about conflicts in the 20th and 21st centuries, including the Liberation Trilogy, a narrative account of the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II. The older I got, the more I found my eye drawn to a story that has beguiled me since I was a boy, perhaps the greatest tale in our national history. And that is the armed struggle for independence that we know as the Revolution. It's a creation story that accounts for who we are, where we came from, what we believe, and what our forebears were willing to die for. As a national saga, it's the stuff of great literature with spectacular characters, variously noble, ignoble, courageous, and tormented, and a plot as improbable as it is spellbinding. I set out to do for the Revolution what I did for the Mediterranean and European theaters in World War II. To write a sweeping narrative, an epic that weaves together tactical combat scenes, marching the reader into battle, with strategic storytelling that illuminates the reasoning and anxieties of those making the decisions that shape both a new nation and Western civilization. My intent is to show war as soldiers and militiamen saw it, terrifying, bestial, and occasionally grand, and as generals fought it, sometimes well, often badly. I also feel that it's important to tell the story from both sides, to see the rebellion as the British saw it and fought it. Toward that end, I spent a lot of research time in Britain, including a month at Windsor Castle where the papers of George III, our last king, are kept. Most have never been published, and Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened them to a small number of scholars, of whom I was among the first. Every day I would climb the 102 stone steps and then 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, where I spent countless hours with George, who throughout the Revolution served as his own secretary. His thoughts and commands are written in his hand, and they're revelatory. I spent years trawling through other archives, large and small, in search of primary sources: diaries, letters, official and unofficial records, unpublished memoirs, newspaper dispatches. The author Shelby Foote once said that a fact is not a truth until you love it. I believe that my strength as a writer and a historian comes from finding facts to love, teasing coherence and intimacy from the past. One of the narrative historian's tasks is to harness scholarship and lucid storytelling to bring back the dead, to breathe life into figures who can seem impossibly remote to a 21st century reader. My ambition has also been to restore the emotional connection between those who took part in that great struggle and today's readers. Not only have the founders been so embalmed in reverence that their human features are often difficult to discern, but the ordinary men and women who lived and died in the Revolutionary era can seem so remote, so faded, that we feel little empathy for them. But this war, like all wars, is a tale of young men dying young, and of people on both sides, from all walks of life, beset with pain, jubilation, apprehension, hope, and sorrow. The Revolution, which lasted 3,089 days, was our first civil war, with all the fraternal violence and heartbreak that implies. It not only brought forth a new nation, afire with a sense of destiny, it embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people. The cause of America, wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, is the cause of all mankind. I look forward to picking up the story of that cause in the 2 volumes of the Revolution trilogy still to come. Even now, the war offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. For better and for worse, it's our story.
On sale now, The British Are Coming. Rick Atkinson's epic story of the American Revolution. Available from the shops at
Hi, everybody. I think we can do without the the advertising at the end, since I think we've all probably bought the book and read it. And that's a really, thank you for sharing that, Connie, because that's a really fun way to kind of, begin thinking about the book. And like I said, I'll just have a couple of things I want to say up front, but I really do want to make this as discussion based as possible. And actually, I want to start, Kevin. I can't see. We can see you there, Kevin, next to Connie. You asked a question. You emailed a question, I should say, not too long before we started, and I think it's a good place to start in terms of thinking about the book. You asked. I don't have the text directly in front of me, Kevin, so correct me if I'm misremembering this, even though you only sent it 20 minutes ago. You asked what scholarship. This is a recent book. This is published in 2019. What sort of veins of scholarship does Rick Atkinson bring in to the discussion in The British Are Coming that are more recent as compared to earlier books? And the book that pops off the top of my mind as being a very similar but much earlier effort. You may have read Robert Middlecoff's book, which I believe is from the 1980s, if I remember correctly, The Glorious Cause, which is an equally sweeping military history of the American Revolution. And that just got me to thinking, and actually Rick Atkinson sort of said this in so many words in that short video. But one of the things that jumped out to me in thinking about your question, Kevin, is 2 things. Well, I said one of them, but there's really 2 things. One is the extent to which Rick Atkinson highlights the violence of the American Revolution, and that we saw the little reenactments in that video. And that's a relatively new feature of American revolutionary historiography. There's a book called Scars of Independence, for example, that I believe was published in 2018 or 2017, which really hammers that point home. I'm also thinking of work by, perhaps you've heard of Alan Taylor, who teaches at the University of Virginia, who also emphasizes the bloodiness and the violence of the American Revolution, which is counterpoise to some of earlier generations' depictions of it as being mostly glorious, not particularly bloody, in terms of the number of casualties, but also in terms of the sort of human misery that all wars created. For a very long time, the American Revolution tended to be framed as relatively mild as far as wars go, in terms of its violent aspects. And so that was something I was thinking about, and that was a really good question you asked, Kevin. And then the second theme of recent scholarship, and this is less recent, meaning that for the last, I would say, 40 years, we've been getting a lot of great work on loyalists in North America. And I think that Rick Atkinson does a really good job of bringing in the loyalist portion of the story, which, as you might may not surprise you to know, that loyalists for a very long time, beginning with the first histories of the American Revolution, which date from the late 18th century, were sidelined, left out, not emphasized as having any meaningful role, having played any meaningful role in the American Revolution, losers, if you will, right? And so I think those two, I think that he's very successful in bringing in scholarship, even though he's not a PhD trained historian, not that everybody needs to be by any means. He's clearly read almost all of the scholarship that was available to him as he was writing this book, and again published in 2019. So those are the two things that sort of jumped into my mind, Kevin, with your question. But what I just want to read, and this is, to me, is in some ways the core theme of the book. And I'm reading, I have my copy here, it's all beaten up, but I'm reading from the prologue, page 25. It's in my copy, which is the paperback copy. I don't know if you'll have a hardcover copy. It's at the bottom of page 25. And it's just, when you read these numbers, and I'll read this out loud, it just reminds you of what the scale of the war itself, both as a continental war, but also as a transatlantic war. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences and then ask y'all if you have any questions. Want to get us started, but no one could foresee, and again, bottom of page 25 in my paperback copy. I think it's the same as a hardcover, but I'm not sure. Yet no one could foresee that the American War for Independence would last 3,059 days, which is interesting because that's longer than World War II, right? For example, which Rick Atkinson made his career, or began his career writing about. Longer than the American Civil War, right? Almost 10 years. Right? My math is terrible, but I can multiply 352 times 10, so almost 10 years. That it would last 3,059 days, or that the struggle would be marked, and this is what really jumped out to me, by more than 1,300 actions, so military actions. And I think that's a corrective too. That's interesting because when people tend to think about the American Revolution, we kind of gravitate toward big battles, right? Or we think about surprise attacks like the Battle of Trenton, which is discussed in this book, or the Battle of Saratoga, which I believe will be in the second volume of this book. Chronologically, it should be. But most of the fighting, as we read through this book, we're reminded was not in the form of large battles, which does separate the American War for Independence from, say, the earlier 7 Years' War in Great Britain, called the French and Indian War by North American colonists, or certainly the American Civil War, right? With massive battles with massive numbers of casualties. That does not define the American Revolution. Small battles, localized battles, but still violent. So the war would be marked by 1,300 actions, mostly small and bloody, with a few large and bloody, plus 241 naval engagements. And the Navy aspect of this war often gets, I wouldn't say that it gets ignored. I just think that there tends to be a focus on army and military, land fighting for the most part. In a theater initially bounded by the Atlantic seaboard, the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers, and the Gulf of Mexico, before expanding to other lands and other waters. So in other words, this is a sweeping, broad scope military history of the American War for Independence, and just reminding us that when we're studying wars, it might not always be the best idea to just look for the big battles, depending on the war, because when we do that with the American Revolution, we find that there aren't that many. 9 out of every 10 battles, conservatively, were relatively small, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't, as we've mentioned, a bloody and violent Civil War, which Rick Atkinson mentions. So those are just my starting thoughts. And we did have a couple of questions that were emailed before, besides Kevin's. Somebody asked when the next 2 volumes are coming out, and I have no idea. Whatever he finishes them, I guess. But given that the first one was published in 2019, I don't imagine it should be too much longer. Although this is painstaking work. And if just reading through the endnotes of this thing, you're just like, he's read everything. So those are my thoughts. Does anybody want to jump in with a comment or a question to start? Because I have some questions too that I can ask to get the conversation started, but just wanted to give anybody the opportunity. Please, Patricia, let me go ahead and unmute you too. Go ahead and unmute. Yeah, there we go. Not yet, no.
Now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Well, I was very impressed with your mention of how our approach to the American Revolution has changed in recent years. And I mean the approach of historians particularly. And that was captured at the very beginning of our organization, RW250, by Connie, when she was worrying about starting to call it a celebration, but that word is no longer acceptable. It's been canceled in a sense. And commemoration is the better word to use now because of what you just, and Kevin just pointed out, that this was a very bloody revolution. In fact, I have a little trouble hearing. Sometimes your voice breaks up. And I don't know if you certainly mentioned that it was a civil war. The problem with the Civil War is the casualties on both sides are from the same group of people. So Americans were dying on both sides to begin with, but also what the what the proportion of people who were casualties and particularly were killed in this war, I don't remember. I know I've heard that it was one of the most, the worst wars that we ever had because it was a civil war next to our own Civil War in the next century. But the sort of per person quota of deaths, I'm not sure about. And I wonder if anyone else picked up that information. What was the percentage of casualties in this war compared to other American wars?
So luckily, that's a really good question. Luckily, the passage I read just a second ago, the next page has some statistics, and I'm looking at page 26 in the paperback. What I have here, I don't know if he mentions a percentage, but he does mention raw numbers, so I'll just read them out loud here. So roughly a quarter, I'm just going to read this verbatim. Page 26. Roughly 250,000 Americans would serve the cause in some military capacity. At least 1 in 10, so I guess there's his percentage. At least 1 in 10 of those 250,000 would die for that cause. 25,674 deaths by one tally, others guessing or estimating 38,500. So that would be between 12 and, I'm terrible at math, but let's say 15%. If we're just, guesstimating between 25,000 and 38,000. So that's what Rick has here. That seems right to me. And Patricia, I know and this is something that's brought up as well, that most of those people died as a result, as in every war, historical war, died of disease rather than being killed in battle or as a result of injuries during battle. I don't think he mentions any kind of percentages there, but I more than half, I think. And there are multiple sections in this book where he discusses smallpox, right, and the various diseases that ravaged both sides, both the British and the American troops. So that's really, again, just reminding us, right, of the human toll, right, that American independence took. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Patricia.
No, you didn't at all. And I know I think I have heard that it was, next to our Civil War, the most destructive war in terms of casualties, but I'm not sure that that's correct, but it certainly was one of the most. That I am quite certain of. And of course, we're not only talking today about the white population. Very much there's concern about the indigenous peoples who were very deeply affected by this war. And we've recently learned, and it is still fairly recent, about the Black soldiers who fought on both sides, actually, of this war. So we've expanded our entire vision of what the revolution was. And I feel a little guilty, you know, waving the flag on the 4th of July these days, because the attitude, especially from historians, is that that's not the thing to do about this war. Instead, you look at the dark side. And I wonder how people feel about that.
I can just say that I agree with you, Patricia, that and let's say especially over the last 10 years. So I started my PhD 12 years ago. And in my time in the business, if we could call it that, I've noticed that to be true too. And you mentioned earlier, right, this difference between celebration and commemoration, right? Which is critical for both revolutionary Westchester 250, but the America 250 efforts, national efforts, right? There could be a little bit more balance, I think. I think recognizing it as being being the American War for Independence as being a world-changing event, or at least hemispheric changing event, doesn't mean that you're inherently saying that it was glorious and that we should all celebrate George Washington. And you brought up something else of interest, and Char, I'm going to kick it over to you next. You know, if with reference to Indigenous Americans and that recent scholarship, especially on Indigenous Americans and bringing them into the scope of the American War for Independence. Like, this isn't really even a criticism of Rick Atkinson because he's written so much here, but you know, one thing that doesn't really appear, at least in this volume, maybe it's different in the second and third volumes whenever they come out, but you really don't see a ton of Indigenous Americans in this. And it's not even really a critique, because he is focused primarily on kind of limited military aspects of the war. But that's just something to point out. Other scholarship, I believe I mentioned Alan Taylor, whose recent book, American Revolutions, actually has a more recent book called American Republics, but American Revolutions really broadens the scope, not just looking at the Eastern Seaboard and Great Britain, but looking west, or looking at Indigenous people looking east during the American Revolution, whichever way you want to think about it. So that was a good point. And that's just worth mentioning. But Char, did you want to go ahead? I see your hands up.
Yeah, so I had kind of an observation and then a question maybe to throw out to you, Michael, and the rest. So the observation is how great it was to read a sequential book, because a lot of time, you know, we're diving in really deep. And it wasn't until I read this that it struck me that the surprise that Nathaniel Greene had when the British came up over the Palisades in Fort Lee, right? Like, they couldn't possibly do that, and there they are, was very similar to Trenton and Washington's troops appearing outside of Trenton, right? Like, oh, they can't cross the Delaware now, like nobody's gonna do that. So, you know, I just thought that was an interesting parallel that came out really, truly, because, you know, we're going at this sequential unveiling. But I guess the question that I'm intrigued with, I really liked his ability to give us a little more insight to characters. I'll use that term, like Howe, like Lee, like Roll, right? And I wondered if what people thought about his depiction of that, and kind of, you know, did they challenge anything that he was saying, or did it add some insights?
Thanks, Char. I'll just broaden it out. This was a question I wanted to ask anyway, but this is a perfect time to do it. Just in general, your question, great question, Char. But also just, I know we have a lot of Westchester local historians here, just in general, the treatment of Westchester in this book. And I just looked it up, but it's chapter, where is it? Chapter 18, sort of near the end of the book, where he really dives in, after going into the Battle of Brooklyn, then follows the war up to Westchester. So I'm curious to know what some local historians thought of those sections just in general. In addition to Char, your question. Does anybody want to dive in?
Um,
Oh yeah, William, go ahead, please. Yeah.
sure. To circle points about bringing to life these, I guess you could describe them as minor battles. Besides the Battle of Long Island, two came to mind. His depiction of the Battle of Harlem Heights and the Battle of Pell's Point, which were, really instrumental, as the army, evacuates. And I appreciated, having walked, the ground now, Pell's Point, being a golf course. I'm right over here on 22, right by the college in Eastchester, so I know the area fairly well. I'm looking down the slope of the Bronx River myself, so I can picture those wonderful depictions of, especially, the Hessian music and the marching orders. The woods almost come alive, as I stare down the hill here. And then to your other point about the Civil War aspect, the capture of the soldiers in the Battle of Fort Washington and the abuse that's hurled back and forth kind of on a large scale for the first time, truly shocked me. And I think he did an excellent job at kind of depicting that frustration from the British talking down to the Americans, officers, threatening to execute the whole lot of them. And then, they're down, genuflecting and saying, please don't do that. So he did a wonderful job, kind of teasing that out. And I think he brought alive, our local geography and history fairly well.
No, I have to
unmute.
I have to unmute myself now. Thanks, William. One of the things, and I think this will connect, and Ed, we'll go to you next, to what Char you mentioned too, which is that, the strict chronology of the book is really helpful. And as a military historian, there's, yeah, it's close to impossible to write a good military history without approaching everything strictly chronologically, which I really appreciated as well, Char, you mentioned. And I think one of the reasons why is because, to sort of zoom out of Westchester, there we go for a second. One of the things you realize, and this is something that, like, for example, I know this, but it still surprised me. Half the book takes place before the Declaration of Independence was created, right? So it's like battle after battle. Like, we all know about the Battle of Bunker. We know about Lexington Concord, and we know about the Battle of Bunker Hill, right? And if we know any battles, if just the general public knows any battle of the American Revolution, it's probably one of those two, right? It's more than a year before the Declaration of Independence. And it's not like there were those two battles and then no fighting and then the Declaration and then the fighting starts again, right? It was consistent, right? And I mentioned this, the more than 1,300 small engagements that comprise the war. It really makes us think, about, well, it definitely makes us think, but it definitely makes me think that more attention could possibly be paid to the earlier stages of the American Revolution. But I say that, Connie, knowing that we did have Mary Beth Norton on one of these book group meetings, and we discussed 1774. And I think I must have said something almost exactly the same to what I just said, but it's something that, and like I mentioned, I'd read this book before. I'd read it a couple of years. There it is, The Long Year of Revolution, written over 1773 to 1775. But it's a good reminder, and it helps us not just focus on major battles and focus on major characters. Sorry, this is sort of connecting to your question, right? I mean, it is interesting how he deals with how Atkinson handles some of the more famous people. It doesn't seem like anybody really comes out looking all that glorious. For the most part on either side, whether British or a rebel. But Connie, you had your hand up, and then Ed will come down to you. I think you were going to respond to the Westchester County specific stuff.
Yeah, William Matthews brought up the same Pell's Point that I thought Atkinson did such a great job on this, because I am a big fan of Glover. I think that story of him behind the walls and kind of tricking everybody who was invading on those ships to thinking that there were tons of people, and there weren't. He was 750 of his marble headers. So I'm glad he paid attention to that. And I'm not a historian, but I was looking for him to footnote some stuff because I've been trying to find it out, and he claimed it. And I now want to write to him and say, because I've been trying to get the actual numbers of the British who landed at Pell's Point, and I can't get that number anywhere. It's like, well, maybe this, well, maybe. So he comes up with a number, and I think, well, where is it? I wanted to know. So that, that's the good. And now I'm, I'm never going to claim I'm a historian, but I'm really getting into it, Michael, I'll tell you. So that excited me. What I thought when you talked about the Declaration of Independence, and I am a big fan of the Declaration. I mean, I think it set the scene for the promises of how government should have a voice from the people. And it just wasn't all the people, unfortunately, but it was a promise. And that's all the revolutions we've gone on since. So I am a big fan. I'm also a big fan of Washington too, by the way. But anyway, I think he left out the role that New York played. White Plains had such an important role in making the Declaration unanimous. And I couldn't find anything about that. So even though he had lots of stuff about Philadelphia, he just left out White Plains. So I'll let some others, locals. I see Ed Woodward. He knows a lot about White Plains too. So I'll
Yeah, go ahead, Ed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. For those who don't know me, I'm the current president of the North Castle Historical Society, and we're gearing up for the 250th and working very closely with Connie, and it's been wonderful. I do want to make an observation about White Plains, because White Plains at the time of the Revolutionary War was known as the White Plains because of its geography, and there was nothing really incorporated. So what has now been consolidated into the Battle of White Plains was really two battles. One was called the Battle of Chatterton's Hill, and the other was called the Battle of Miller Hill. And Miller Hill is in North Castle, and the Miller Hill is the only remaining intact Revolutionary War battle site left in the county. The readouts and the ramparts from the battle are still there. And we're in the process now of working with the county to restore it and get it back to a situation with signage and maps and things like that to get that going. That's part of our deal for the 250th. What is important about the Battle of Miller Hill is that it stopped the British advance. How it was coming up what is now Broadway. And if you can see through the trees now and past some of the buildings that have been constructed, the promontory up there looked straight down at Broadway and came by the church. And they came up and they were able to hold them off from making any further advance into New York or to that fact, into New England. So subsequently, Howe turned around and went back into New York. And so that in and of itself is a pretty remarkable feat. And we like to think that it helped change the direction of the war. And on a personal level, I had 3 direct ancestors who were there, one of whom was killed at the age of 21 and is buried in the Presbyterian churchyard, right near the Millers, Elijah and Ann Miller. So anyway, but I just think that I think Westchester has an enormously important role to play, and especially later on with Rochambeau and Washington and is rightfully known as the cradle of final victory, which was a term that came out, I think, during the 1920s or 1930s about the important role that Westchester played in the resolution of this war and in its final victory. So anyway, that's my 2 cents for the moment. Thank you.
I was just trying to find this, Ed, in the index. Does Atkinson distinguish between the two battles, or does he just call them both Battle of White Plains? He does. Okay. He doesn't. Okay. Thank you. I mean, any other thoughts on the sort of more Westchester specific portions of the book? Or any other thoughts not about that?
I have, I have a thought.
Dick, go ahead. Sure.
I think that the motivation of General Howe, who was very silent while his wives and sisters wrote about the Howe brothers, Howe really didn't want to follow through. He wanted to win the war without inflicting massive casualties. And he was a minority, and Atkinson touches on this, in a minority back in England. He was a Whig, and he was very cautious. He could have finished off Washington, but instead, as you mentioned before, he went into New York City. I would like, as we go through the revolution, especially in the second and third editions, is how did the war change once Howe was forced to go back to England? There's been some scholarship on this, and I really believe that Atkinson, when he does the second and third editions, and he will talk more about the Native Americans, especially in upstate New York. I'm really looking forward to see how that minority of people in Parliament, which Howe was a member, how that motivated, especially when England became fed up with the war at the end, because this was the only revolution, and this is something I hope that we touch on in modern history that actually worked. And I hope when Atkinson continues his excellent narrative, that we will get more insights into why our revolution worked while other modern revolutions failed. That's something I'm really looking forward to finding out the answer to. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. I mean, I would say, when you say work, do you just mean permanently yet to be overturned? Is that what you mean?
Our revolution worked. There was a balance between the rule of law and the desire for human rights. And Atkinson touches on this on his narrative, but again, he stops in 1777. But and as the war progressed, no other area suffered longer than Westchester, and all these things are as we go through this, and it has, as we've said before, it has to be a commemoration. But while we commemorate, and there were people who were women, Native Americans, African Americans, who didn't benefit like the other people. But what was it about the founders? What was it about the soldiers that eventually led to an American triumph that has lasted up till now for almost 240 years? And as we further explore it from multiple perspectives, I'm hoping to come to a clearer answer, especially for the young people. They really have to, and Atkinson touched on this in his that excellent video. We have to bring him, and there's a lot of interest among young people about the American Revolution, and I'm excited about where we're going. So I've raised more questions that we don't have answers to now, but it's questions that we should be seeking answers to. Am I clear on that, Mike?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dick. I mean, it just makes me think, one thing I will say is that I struggle with this. I write about Thomas Paine, and so obviously there's a lot of overlap with this book and what I'm working on. But one of the things that your comments makes me think, Dick, is trying to keep a separation between the actual events of a war for independence, whether it's the American War for Independence or the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution. And what you could say, the Haitian Revolution is still successful, but keep it a kind of intellectual difference between wars themselves and the nations that developed afterwards, because they're not always the same. They're not the same thing chronologically, right? Like I said, you could say the Haitian Revolution still has been not been overturned, but I don't think anybody would say that Haiti's been as successful, if you will, of a country as the United States has been. So that's just something that I think about a lot, right? Like when you assess the nation that was birthed, if you will, even though I hate that metaphor often when we talk about revolutions, as a result of the American War for Independence, and you're getting into another completely separate set of questions, right? But I think, Jonathan, did you have your hand up? Jonathan.
Yes. Just a brief point was really the success. You've been talking about the war and the different battles, and that Atkinson is talking about, and his contribution to that by going sequentially. To me, I'm as fascinated by the discussion sequentially of where the British were in their determination and in their process of realizing that this was a revolution that was going to end up being way more complicated than they suspected to begin with. And I think their lack of knowledge, which Atkinson points out, of really what, who, and why the American colonists were about. It's sort of shocking that they knew so little, and even though sometimes they got the information, they didn't open the envelopes and the packets of information. And sadly, it sort of reminds you of what certain wars that and actions that America, as well as of course other countries, have taken, where they have little or no knowledge about the people, the culture, the rationale of why they're fighting, and really just sort of the mechanics about the country and people that they're going in to have a war with, and they're that seems to be a continual theme for wars. You go in and it's going to be done before Christmas.
That's a really good point, and Connie, I might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure I used this phrase the last book group that we had, which was a few months ago, if I'm remembering correctly. But one of the things that jumps out, especially when you're reading a book that is so like this, that he's so closely to chronology, is he realized information asymmetry was all over the place. I mean, letters are being lost, people can't communicate with each other. What on the surface seems like a spectacularly dumb decision, let's say in the field of battle or in terms of deploying troops, often comes down to just like not having information or having incomplete information. And we kind of, this is an obvious thing to say in the 21st century. We're used to having instantaneous communication, which was not the case in the late 18th century. But so many of the key points just of the American War for Independence just come down to people not having information, or having incomplete information, or having incorrect information, or not getting that letter until like 2 days later, when if they had gotten it 2 days before, the Battle of Trenton, for example, I'm just, off the top of my head, like could have turned out differently, and that's a really interesting point. And I'll also point, Jonathan, just to get back to one other thing you said. If you're interested in some of the themes you brought up, Jonathan, there's a book, I think it's 10 years old now, perhaps a little bit older, by Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. It's called The Men Who Lost America, but it's a study of the British statesmen, imperial administrators who lost the war. And it tends to, he focuses on high level, prime minister level, and imperial official level stuff. But when you're bringing up this idea that they meaning imperial policymakers and military planners, didn't always know what they were up against, that's a major theme of the book. And you can kind of guess from the title, he thinks that imperial administrators, I'm not going to swear, messed up from London. Shar, you have a question. You have your hand up.
Yeah, so Jonathan, hi Jonathan, Terry Ann, his question made me think about another thing that kept coming back to me in the book too, which is the civilian population and the treatment of the civilian population. And certainly in Westchester, there's a lot more to be said about that than he could, fairly, like, he's got a big task in front of him. We know a lot about what was going on in terms of the tenant farmers and the loyalists and the patriots and how Westchester itself was dividing up. But that was a real challenge. And I think maybe, William, you said with Fort Washington, and as those soldiers were people were, wanting to hit them and throw things at them, that of course was military on military, but still showed some of this. The rapes that he wrote about, there's a lot more in Westchester about burning of houses and turning people out that hasn't yet at least made it into his book. And the difficulty that both armies had, frankly, in controlling the average man that was fighting there and recognizing what it means to turn a population against them, which is resonant with a lot of current events that we're thinking about right now too.
Yeah.
To piggyback on what you said, Shar, about the burnings, there was the famous when Tarleton went into Bedford and burned Bedford. And then he came right down Route 22 and went into the city from there.
Yeah,
So,
it actually wasn't
that's-
Tarleton that burned Bedford, but
I
Tarleton
thought
was up
Tarleton was
there.
involved in that.
He preceded with the Pound Ridge attack, but the Bedford Historical Society has really done a lot of good scholarship to identify, who actually was involved, and the name's escaping me of the person.
Okay.
Do you have it, Connie?
Colonel Birch was the second
Birch.
attack, and poor Tarleton got the blame for burning the whole village of Bedford. He only attacked like 11 days earlier and burned a few places. Anyway, so you're part right, Ed.
But
Okay,
still,
thank you.
Tarleton's a good
stand
example of
corrected.
that
Thank you.
brutality that you're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, I know Shar and others and Pat Bonamy, that many of you might have read a lot about the Hessians, right? The auxiliary troops. And I was interested in how Atkinson was treating them. And of course, you've got to love how Atkinson finds these tons of letters and quotes from individuals, from this soldier, from that soldier. And I've always felt that the Hessians were viewed in things that you read as more cruel and more horrible than the other players in this war. And I was wondering kind of where that prejudice came and why that was, because it feels like Atkinson gives a lot of letters of the British soldiers acting badly. And we know Washington had a lot of problems with controlling his soldiers and how they were stealing things and, causing trouble, Shar, as you're talking about that. So anyway, there seems to be an overlay of prejudice from the British, from generations about the Hessians. And I just find that interesting. They were not mercenaries. They were hired by their princes, Hesse and Kassel and these other places. So they were professional soldiers, but they were, seems like, equally bad as I can figure it from the others. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, they had the reputation going back to Frederick the Great in 1730s and 40s for just being the crack troops of what would become Germany in the 1870s. And I think that's where it came from. They just had this sort of like reputation as being the, excuse my language, but the badass troops in Europe, if that makes sense. Although, as Atkinson points out, every single side committed atrocities. And he said something, Connie and Char, that made me think, and if Atkinson mentions this, and probably does, I'm just not remembering where. It's worth keeping in mind that just looking at the side of the American forces, most of the at least 100,000 people that served the American war effort, we read that quotation earlier. The vast majority of those people did not fight in the Continental Army, right? Which is kind of what we associate with the American war effort, but were state militias, and local to state, individual colonial/state militias, which made it inherently more difficult to control them, right? Because they're more interested in following the commands of the the captains that they themselves selected, right, rather than being commanded around by even somebody like George Washington, but appointees of the Continental Congress, which is just worth keeping in mind. And Vic's, I'm looking at your comment here, Vic. The Hessians were actually intimidated by the Stockbridge Indians. Interesting. Well, Connie, we have a few more minutes. Are there any other last questions or comments to make?
I'm just curious about how much some people just quick comments about how much you appreciated his narrative style or not. Was this something that was a big plus? I mean, he's quite a storyteller in my book, but the writing of it, I'd just be curious how people felt like as a page turner or as too much detail, or what did you think about that kind of history writing? Anybody, just a quick.
We know Ed liked it.
Ed liked it.
As we see here, I'm looking at your comment, Ed.
Yeah. I liked it very much. And I'm very anxious about the other 2 volumes.
Yeah, I'm not sure when. I have no idea when. I would guess the second one isn't that far off, just based on the fact that the first one this one published 5 years ago, but I have no idea.
I thought it was the best and most complete history of the battle in Westchester that I've ever read. And I think he's an excellent writer. I appreciated the comment about writing chronologically because, of course, that's the secret weapon if they only knew it. You have to think of cause and effect. And the other thing that I realized from this book and from our conversation today, this battle that we call the Battle of White Plains, even though it was mainly seems to have been fought in the eastern part of the county, really was sort of a crossing the Rubicon point, although in this case it was crossing the Hudson, because I believe from that point on, George Washington must have had some realization you can't fight typically just standing in rows firing muskets at each other. This is a different terrain, a different story altogether. But after he crossed the Hudson, it seems to become more of a guerrilla war in some ways. And that would be something I think it would be fun to talk about if we had more time. Because when supply lines are long, as they were for the British, and the people here can take off their uniforms and put on civilian clothes more easily than the British, that turns it into a different kind of a war. So I've had a much better appreciation of what this Westchester fighting was about from this book, and I'm so glad we read it.
H. Breen has written a number of books focusing that it wasn't just that the French came in, which was monumental in our victory. It wasn't that England was just getting tired. It was a will of the American people. And T.H. Breen and a number of other scholars have really stressed that they were unwilling. Their intensity of support was much greater than that of the Loyalists. And that's something that we should continue to examine. And we shouldn't ignore the inequities, but we should also, in some ways, understand why we won this conflict and why it has endured. I think that's very important.
I think he does a good job about bringing about or highlighting the mismatched expectations that are leading up to the Revolutionary period, especially in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. As the imperial domain grows, the Americans come to expect through their participation that they're going to be kind of this bi-unitary construction, and the English are really just seeing them as another part of the imperial component. They're just a singular part of that larger component. I think he does a good job at highlighting those two kind of separated paths that the two peoples are finding themselves on.
Yeah, thank you, William and Dick. One of the things that I'm just now realizing, it's not a thought I had while I was rereading it over the last few days. And just relative to the writing, which I think is awesome, snappy, right? Keeps the pace of the story going. You know, one of the things that's interesting and I think refreshing in a way about this book is that, and this is going to sound terrible, and I don't mean it this way, like it's relatively free of political ideas, right? So a lot of the scholarship over the last few decades is focused on the ideas, and this goes back to Bernard Bailyn in the 1960s.
Howard Zinn.
There's no intellectual history in this. It is just the actual history of the actual skirmishes and battles that happened. And when I think about it that way, it makes me like the writing a little bit more. Which isn't to say that the history of ideas is bad. I write intellectual history in large part, but it's interesting just to sort of think about it that way. Like, you know, for a book that is 580 pages, if I remember correctly, you know, like the Declaration of Independence basically just gets mentioned and then skipped over, right? Whereas other books would, you know, like, including my own, you know, if I'm being honest, like make that a huge point. Like, what are the political ideals behind the American Revolution, right? The only people whose ideas we really get are the British, which is interesting and refreshing in its way. Again, I hope I don't mean to sound mean saying there's no ideas in this book, but in a way there aren't, which is interesting.
I think that one of the strengths of it being told chronologically, and we've brought this up before, is the fact that you can't make any kind of conclusions on what happened at the time because you don't have the Monday morning quarterbacking of 2020 hindsight on what is happening at that time. And in and of itself creates this great mystery, this great thriller, and it led to the quality of the writing and the way it was plotted. So anyway, that's another of my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's just it's a way that a trained PhD like myself wouldn't approach the topic necessarily, which is maybe why I like it so much, or just appreciate that way of looking at things. So Connie, did you want to?
Well, first of all, we'll end it very soon here, but I did want to point out that your scholarship is on Thomas Paine, and I don't know when your book is coming out, but we know it will be soon.
Don't ask, Connie.
Thomas Paine is coming. Okay. And the other thing, Pat Bonamy, our wonderful friend here in Irvington, where I am, is quite a scholar, meritee of New York University, and written so much about the revolution, and I'm very happy to call her a friend. And some of you are very active in your local historical societies, and besides just Ed, I saw Peter Marcus here from Ardsley. And, you know, this is why we keep going with this Revolutionary Westchester 250. It's people like all of you. Dick has, 40 years of teaching in the public schools. Good on you, Richard. So, and Vic DeSanto, whose top of his head is visible, doing a lot of writing for the Journal of the American Revolution. And that's, he's done a lot on the what's known as the Stockbridge Indians and all that happened. So we've got a lot of scholarship to, expose the public to. And I think Atkinson, with his really page-turning approach, granted, no PhD in history, but we've been choosing books from all different attitudes of the authors, and I think that's a good approach to our book discussion. So as I had said, first of all, you can suggest books to me by email, and we kind of think about what authors are available and what's hot at the time. And my husband also put down, I put to everybody in the chat, this site for Atkinson's site, the revolutionarytrilogy.com. So that's where we might get the news on when the next book is coming. When he knows, that might be where it first appears. So if there's not anything else, and I want to, Shar Weigel serves as my vice president for special projects, Mark Cheshire as vice president. And we have such a great team. And you know, you're all invited. Come to our things. Where Michael serves on our advisory committee, and it's been my pleasure to be doing this crazy work for 5 years now, and 2 more to go. So don't leave me. You know, I can't. I need my army here to make things happen. So stick.
You're doing
with
a great job, Connie.
Oh God, thank you, Ed. I mean, thank you.
Thanks for being at the
I
helm.
have my moments, I'll tell you, when things are falling
Don't we all?
apart. But we have a lot of good stuff. Mark does so much with our social media, so maybe you don't like Facebook anymore, but boy, we get a lot of stuff out on Facebook. And if you're not signed up for I could take your names off of this and put you on the mailing list if you're not, but I'm not supposed to do that. You're supposed to ask to be on the mailing list. So if you don't get our monthly newsletter, by all means, go to RW250.org and just get your name there. And then if you don't see it, look in your spam. You know, it might be going elsewhere. So with that, you know, anybody go out for a walk here? It's probably 15 degrees by now. We'll have a great time. So
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yep, thanks everybody for
Michael?
joining.
Let's do this in the next couple of months.
Yeah, we
okay?
just need another book to discuss.
Oh, we got one, I'm sure.
So let me know. These are really fun. I really enjoy these. So thank you everybody
Public
for being here.
historian, that's what you're all about, Michael. You really get out there, so thank you. Okay, you
Okay,
can hit
bye
the
everybody.
end.
Thank you. Thanks,
Yep.
Michael.